rescue team is trapped with monsters on an abandoned ship. The space surveillance vessel Academic Vladislav Volov is in the southern regions of the Pacific Ocean. The crew is establishing contact with the Mir Scientific Research Orbital Station. Once connected, Nadia Vinogradova, who is in charge of the mission, requests that the astronauts transmit the collected data for further study. Nadia, who knows how to balance work and relaxation, manages to play a game of chess with one of the astronauts and share tender moments with her husband, the ship's captain. Meanwhile, a woman at the station notices a strange object approaching at high speed. She takes a photo and asks her colleagues to look through the peephole to identify the unknown object. Its nature and structure are obscure, but visually, it resembles a cluster of electromagnetic pulses that suddenly pass through the station. Video and radio contact with the station is lost, and during brief connections, the astronauts call for help. Seconds later, the data transmission from the station to the ship begins, during which something infiltrates the vessel and starts hacking the main computer, attempting to decode the access code. The ship's commander considers this situation impossible, but the entity takes control of the systems. The crew is on the brink of survival and becomes hostages of an unknown force that has seized control of the main computer. 7 days later, a small tugboat called Star of the Sea finds itself approximately in the same region. The crew has deviated from their usual route and ends up in a typhoon. Foster reports that wind speeds are increasing and they may be caught in a hurricane. Captain Everton orders a course change to sail against the wind, believing this will keep them afloat and prevent them from becoming victims of the storm. Noticing that the barge they are towing is rapidly taking on water, Foster informs the captain, but he refuses to take further action, believing that his ship has endured worse conditions. During a new attempt to change course, a massive wave strikes the ship, damaging not only the hull of the Star of the Sea, but also breaking the mast, blocking access to the deck. Part of the superstructure is damaged, allowing water to flood the engine room. Realizing that the situation is critical, engineer Steve Baker asks the crew to cut the door with a torch, as it is the only way to reach the deck and secure the engine room. With the crew's situation worsening by the second, Foster charts a course for the eye of the typhoon. Within this zone, they will have a few hours of respite to repair the ship and prepare for the next storm. On the bridge, Steve urges the captain to jettison the barge because its weight could drag them down like an anchor. Everton vehemently refuses, wanting to deliver the barge to port for the reward. Steve is ready to release the barge, but the captain threatens him with a revolver. Their argument is interrupted when another huge wave strikes the ship, breaking the line and sending the barge to the bottom. Foster and Steve see this as a victory, as they could have sunk with it. Everton, having spent all his savings on the barge, feels devastated. Reluctant to give orders, he agrees to head into the center of the cyclone and locks himself in his cabin. In the early morning, Everton drinks heavily and contemplates ending his life in a game of Russian roulette. The crew tries to revive the ship and patch all the holes, pumping water out of the engine room. After welding and checking the hull, they conclude that the Star of the Sea is at its limit and likely won't survive another typhoon. The crew loses hope as they only have a few days of food and water left. Suddenly, Foster brings a glimmer of hope, reporting that there is a ship 12 miles away that is not moving. Determining it to be a large, heavy vessel, Foster tries to contact the crew but only receives silence in response. Everton soon discovers about the stationary ship, regaining new hope and a will to live. As they get closer, Woods attempts to establish contact again, but with no success. A few meters away, the crew spots overturned lifeboats and then the enormous ship they belong to. Foster identifies the vessel as Russian, the Academic Vladislav Volov, a satellite and missile tracking ship equipped with parabolic antennas, modern laboratories, and robotic workshops. A few meters from the vessel, Everton makes a final attempt to contact the crew using a loudspeaker. When no one responds, he asks Steve to take climbing gear, lanterns, and other tools so they can board and investigate. A few minutes later, everyone except Woods boards the Academic Vladislav Volov. Steve and Squeaky go ahead and notice numerous bullet holes, realizing something terrible has happened there. The bridge is empty, which pleases Everton. The power is off, and the radio is broken. The ship's logbook does not help the international crew, as no one understands Russian. The situation excites the crew and the captain because they can tow the ship to the nearest port. According to maritime law, an abandoned ship in international waters belongs to whoever finds it. so nothing is preventing their plan. The ship is worth about $300 million, which would mean considerable compensation. The captain promises to be fair and generous, giving each crew member $3 million in cash. Foster is less optimistic, reminding everyone that easy money rarely comes without a price. She also points out that the ship isn't technically abandoned if there is even one survivor on board. To her horror, Everton is indifferent to this and is willing to eliminate any survivor to secure potential payment. After giving orders, the captain prepares the ship for towing, but first they need to restore power to start the turbine engines. Steve and Squeaky head to the engine room to get the equipment up and running. The control panel is broken and the relays are ripped out, but the engineer and his colleague quickly fix the problem and restore power. As they do this, the central computer and the robots in the workshop come to life. The electrical wiring shorts out, producing a terrifying noise, but the most alarming thing is that the surveillance cameras are functioning autonomously. Foster warns the captain that someone is controlling the computer, but he dismisses it as impossible. After tracking the location of the tugboat, something releases a massive anchor and penetrates it. Heo is injured and in bad shape, but Woods refuses to rescue him, thinking his own life is more important. Foster wants to jump in and help her colleague, but the captain forbids her from taking the risk. Steve, who is always at odds with Everton, leaves Squeaky in the engine room and runs to help. After pulling the injured Heo from the water, Steve tells Squeaky to lock herself in, suspecting that someone else on board is causing sabotage after the last incident and the sinking of the tugboat. Steve questions Everton's role, but the captain suggests they forget their differences to achieve their common goal. Understanding that they need to split up, Woods and Richie are ordered to go to the engine room and help Squeaky. The captain and Steve search for the medical station to treat Heiko's injury. Meanwhile, small robots begin to come to life and crawl around the ship, but the crew ignores this. Squeaky is the first to notice something strange when he sees a cable being pulled into a pipe. Trying to figure out what's going on, Squeaky follows the robot to a tangle of wires, where he is suddenly attacked and disappears. Woods and Richie find an arsenal and decide to upgrade their gear in case of conflicts on the way to the port. Going down a bit further, they discover a missile launch well and 2 catapults for emergency evacuation. Woods is frightened by all the blood around him, but Richie is confident they can handle any enemy. Meanwhile, Foster is sewing up Heiko's leg, discussing what they will do with the money. Heiko dreams of opening schools for children in poor countries. Steve wants to buy an island and invite Foster to join him, but the navigator isn't used to dreaming, doubting they will get the money. At one moment, Steve opens a medicine cabinet, and suddenly a person wearing a gas mask appears and starts shooting wildly, nearly killing the entire crew. Steve quickly neutralizes the threat, discovering that the shooter is Nadia, the only survivor from the Russian ship's crew. This revelation disappoints Everton. Steve tries to contact Squeaky, but there is no response. Realizing something is wrong, he heads to the engine room and orders Richie and Woods to follow him. On the way, the 2 crew members encounter a robot and, terrified, strike it in a desperate attempt to defend themselves. Nadia wakes up terrified and pleads for them to cut off the power as quickly as possible to prevent the entity from moving. She explains that the rest of the crew did not survive the energy attack that came from the Mir station, using gas to kill people, but some managed to escape in lifeboats. No one believes her crazy story, except for Foster, who decides to act quickly. Nadia pushes the captain aside and rushes to cut off the power, grabbing an axe and heading towards the cables, but Foster stops her. Nadia pleads with her not to interfere, insisting that the entity is using electricity for its own purposes and no one will survive. Heiko ties her up to prevent her from posing a threat to the rest of the crew. Woods and Richie find a laboratory full of robots. They cut off the power, but a short circuit restores the functioning process. As they begin to examine the environment more closely, one of the robots attacks them, injuring Woods with nails. Another robot appears and starts shooting at them, but they manage to hide and warn Steve about the danger via radio. When Steve arrives at the engine room, he tries to open the door, but it is welded shut, and Squeaky is nowhere to be found. Soon, injured Richie and Woods also arrive. They realize something strange is happening when a robot suddenly attacks them, opening fire. Working together, Steve and the team disable the robot by cutting its power wires. Everton suspects that Nadia is behind the sabotage on the ship and threatens her with a revolver, demanding to know where Squeaky is hiding. Foster realizes that Nadia couldn't be responsible since she had been hiding in the medical room the whole time. Although Everton and Heiko remain suspicious of Nadia, she insists they need to cut off the power to prevent the alien energy from terrorizing them. Soon, the rest of the crew arrives on the bridge, bringing the remains of a robot. Nadia is horrified to recognize her husband, Alexei, in the remnants of the robot. Squeaky is still missing, and the crew is confused, but Foster urges Nadia to finish her story, increasingly believing in her reality. Nadia explains that the energy corrupted the main computer, navigation, and other electronic systems, completely taking control of the ship. Initially, the system began to build resource-hunting robots, followed by biomechanical creatures made from human parts. When the surviving crew members abandoned the ship, Alexei and Nadia decided to stay and cut all power cables, but it seems that her husband was caught by the robots and became part of a biomechanical entity. To verify Nadia's story, Richie examines the biomechanical creature and finds an electronic implant in its brain sustaining its life. Suddenly, the robot grabs Nadia's hand, but Steve finishes it off with the butt of his rifle. Everton remains skeptical, suggesting there are no aliens, and what they see is the result of failed Russian experiments to combat external threats. Soon, the ship encounters a storm, and the crew needs to change course to avoid sinking. The robot made from Alexei's body reanimates, but Richie knocks it down with several well-placed shots. Realizing the danger, the crew rushes to leave the ship as quickly as possible. Going down to a lower deck, they notice that the alien energy has intelligence and is altering the course to preserve the ship. Upon heading to the engine room, they hear knocking behind the door. Peeking inside, Steve claims he sees Squeaky, but the others hesitate to open the door, fearing something terrible is lurking behind it. Squeaky breaks the door, now a hostile biomechanical entity. It grabs Woods and lifts him up, only to be killed by a massive robot that follows. Squeaky, shooting back and fleeing, the crew takes shelter in the communication room. Richie tries to call for help, but Everton destroys the radio, declaring it his ship and that he doesn't need competition for the reward money. Furious, Foster punches the captain and frees Nadia. Meanwhile, a robot is trying to break through the walls and is about to enter. Recognizing this, Richie decides to communicate with the computer controlled by the unknown life form. The team discovers that the hostile energy sees humanity as a virus and intends to exterminate them, using human parts as building material. After a quick discussion, the team concludes that the best way to prevent disaster and stop the alien energy from spreading is to sink the ship. Richie refuses to be a victim of the robots, so he shoots the biobot Squeaky and separates from the main group. As the team goes out to try to shut down the main computer, Everton does not accompany them. Instead, he contacts the entity, offering to take it to New Zealand or Australia in exchange for his life. Going to the workshop, Everton encounters a robot and makes a deal. The team reaches their destination and realizes that the entity has moved the main computer elsewhere. They are then attacked by a large robot, but Nadia, Foster, Steve, and Heiko manage to escape to the deck. Nadia suggests going to the antenna's targeting location, believing it to be the safest place during the storm. Foster falls from the ladder, but Heiko saves her, sacrificing himself as he is swept into the sea, while Richie prepares an explosive device and defends himself from small robots. Foster and Nadia discover that the alien intelligence is directing them to an island where British intelligence is located. Understanding the need to prevent the spread of biomechanical organisms, they formulate a plan to sink the ship. Soon, they are contacted by a nearby vessel, but Steve decides not to respond to avoid leading the alien energy to it. Shortly after, the trio is found by Everton, who has become a biobot but retains his consciousness. Foster shoots him, but it causes little damage. Realizing the strength of the enemy, Nadia uses a thermobaric grenade, and Steve pushes Everton out of the room, where he is finally killed. Planning to set the explosions and fill the ship with fuel, the trio finds Richie and warns him about their plan. Armed and disoriented, Richie no longer acts as part of the team and sticks to his own plan, filling the ship with fuel and preparing an explosive device with a 15-minute timer. The team prepares to evacuate, but a massive sentient robot attacks them. Trapped, Steve and Nadia fall and lose consciousness. Foster falls into a sea of fuel and bodies, but is captured by the robot, which interrogates her using electric shocks. Several minutes later, Steve and Nadia attack the robot, but inflict little damage. Unexpectedly, Richie joins them and shoots the robot with a grenade launcher, freeing Foster. The robot retaliates, collapsing part of the metal structure and leaving Steve in a precarious position, while Nadia and Foster manage to escape, hiding behind several metal doors. The women find diving suits and prepare for evacuation. As time runs out, Steve dismantles the metal structure and finds an injured Richie before he dies. Richie reveals critical information about the missile silo and the catapult, which could help them escape quickly from the ship. Nadia and Foster are ready to jump into the water when they encounter the giant robot again. It has found and destroyed the detonator, thwarting their initial plan. Realizing they cannot escape, Nadia pleads with Foster to flee and pushes her into an adjacent room, allowing herself to be grabbed by the robot. Nadia promises to reveal the locations of the remaining detonators, sacrificing herself. She shoots at the gas cylinders, causing a large explosion that only slightly damages the robot. It continues to chase Foster, who is then found by Steve. The pair heads to the missile silo, as Richie had advised. Once there, Steve ties Foster to the catapult and prepares her for launch. The robot approaches, and Steve plans to sacrifice himself heroically to ensure Foster's survival as the enormous robot bursts into the missile silo. Foster binds Steve to her and activates the device. They successfully launch from the ship, and the catapult tied to a cable with grenades left by Richie releases the pin, leading to a massive explosion that completely destroys the ship. Noticed by a nearby vessel, a helicopter arrives to rescue the survivors in the morning. Foster spots Hio and tries to check if he is alive, but a disfigured man attacks her. She wakes up and realizes it was just a horrible nightmare, with Steve comforting her, assuring her that it is all over and that they defeated the evil entity that had taken over the Russian ship.